On the morning of the 27th of April, 1823, in a clearing hacked out of the jungle on the Mosquito Coast of Central America, an Edinburgh cobbler sat up on the floor of a bamboo hut, took a horse pistol he had loaded to the muzzle, and shot himself in the head. The doctor who had been treating his fever found what was left of him a short while later, and wrote in his diary that the man had literally blown himself to pieces. Before he died, the cobbler had asked the doctor to do two things: take charge of his small property, and see that a letter reached his wife, back home in Scotland. That cobbler had crossed an ocean because he believed he was going to be the official shoemaker to a princess. He had been promised a title, a workshop, a fine city with paved streets, and a cathedral, and an opera house, and a bank, in the capital of a young and prosperous country called Poyais. He had sold what little he owned to get there, and when his ship finally landed him on that beach, there was no city, there was no princess, there was no country at all. There was only swamp, and fever, and the rotting timbers of a hut where two American traders had once lived and given up. How does a poor shoemaker end up dead in a jungle that does not match a single word he was told about it? The answer is one of the strangest and cruelest stories in the long history of fraud. It begins with a charming Scottish soldier who decided that the simplest way to get rich was not to rob a country or to swindle one, but to invent one from nothing, to draw it on a map, give it a flag and a constitution and a currency, print a guidebook describing its rivers and its gold, sell its government bonds on the stock exchange in London, sell its land to families like the cobblers, and then load those families onto ships and send them to a stretch of empty coastline where most of them would die. This is the story of Gregor MacGregor, the man who invented a nation, and of the hundreds of ordinary people who paid for that invention with their lives. To understand how this could happen, you have to understand the man, and you have to understand the moment. Both were necessary. Neither alone would have been enough. Gregor MacGregor was born on the 24th of December, 1786, at Glengyle in the Scottish Highlands, into a family that carried a famous and dangerous name. He was a kinsman, by his own telling, of Rob Roy MacGregor, the outlaw folk hero whose legend was already being polished into romance. Gregor grew up on stories of Highland glory, of clansmen and chiefs and noble blood, and somewhere in his youth he seems to have decided that a name like his deserved a destiny to match. At 16 he bought a commission in the British Army, the 57th Regiment of Foot, and went off to fight in the long wars against Napoleon. He served on the Iberian Peninsula, he married a wealthy young woman, and then, in 1810, after a quarrel with a superior officer, he left the army under a cloud, and his world began to shrink. A smaller man might have settled into a quiet life. MacGregor did the opposite. When his first wife died, he gathered up what money was left and sailed for South America, where the Spanish colonies were rising in revolt, and a soldier of fortune could remake himself overnight. And for a while, he genuinely did. He joined the fight for independence. He served under Francisco de Miranda, then under the great liberator Simón Bolívar, whose relative he married. He was made a general. In 1816, he led a fighting retreat across hundreds of miles of Venezuelan country, harried the whole way by Spanish forces, and brought a column out alive. That was real. That happened. For one brief season, Gregor MacGregor was something close to the hero he had always told himself he was. But the courage came with a flaw that followed him everywhere. He was vain, he was impatient, and when a situation turned against him, he had a habit of saving himself first and explaining later. In 1817, he seized Amelia Island off the coast of Florida and grandly proclaimed a Republic of the Floridas, then watched the whole adventure collapse. In 1819, he led an expedition against the Spanish at Portobello, and when it went wrong, he slipped away to a ship and abandoned his own men to capture and death. Later that same year, at Rio de la Hacha, he did almost exactly the same thing again. By the start of the 1820s, his reputation as a fighter was in ruins. The medals and the titles were behind him. He needed a new story, a bigger one, and he found it on a malarial shore in Central America. In 1820, MacGregor traveled to the Mosquito Coast, a wild and barely governed strip of land along what is now Honduras and Nicaragua. There he met a local ruler, a man the British called King George Frederick Augustus, the chief of the Mosquito people. The two of them spent some days together with a good deal of rum involved, and at the end of it, the king put his name to a document granting MacGregor a vast tract of territory, 8 million acres by some accounts, a piece of jungle and swamp said to be larger than Wales. To the king, it may have meant very little. He was handing away land he did not really control to a foreigner who flattered him. To MacGregor, it was the raw material for the largest confidence trick anyone had ever attempted. Because here is the thing, he did not come back to Britain and try to sell 8 million acres of jungle. Jungle is a hard sell. Instead, on the voyage home and in the months after, Gregor MacGregor performed an act of pure imagination. He took that empty grant and built a country on top of it, entirely in his own head, and then committed every detail of it to paper as if it already existed. He named it Poyais. He gave himself a title that sounded ancient and royal and yet was vague enough that no one could check it. Cazique of Poyais, which he let everyone understand to mean prince. He was no longer a disgraced general, he was a head of state. Now, for the moment that made him possible. In the early 1820s, London was the richest financial center on earth, and it was hungry. The long wars with France were over. British government bonds, the safe and boring investment everyone knew, were paying very little, the yield having drifted down to somewhere above 3%. Investors with money sitting idle wanted more, and they had found a thrilling new place to put it. Across the Atlantic, one Spanish colony after another was breaking free and declaring itself a nation. Colombia, Chile, Peru, Mexico. These young republics came to London needing cash, and they raised it the modern way, by issuing government bonds that paid 6% or better. To a London investor, it looked like the opportunity of a lifetime. Exotic, profitable, and backed by the romance of liberty. Money poured into Latin American loans, and the men selling them grew careless about what exactly they were buying. That was the world MacGregor walked into, a market primed to believe in brand new countries it had never seen, paying interest rates that real banks could not match. Poyais was simply one more young nation seeking investment. The only difference, the difference nobody noticed, was that this one was not real. He played the part to perfection. MacGregor and his wife arrived in London and took fine rooms in the most fashionable parts of the city. He carried himself like exactly what he claimed to be, a foreign prince of impeccable breeding who had no particular need of anyone's money. He was received in good society. He met members of parliament and lord mayors. He opened a legation of Poyais, an official office, as any sovereign nation would have in a great capital. He appointed a charge d'affaires. He printed up the trappings of statehood with extraordinary care. There was a Poyais flag. There was a coat of arms. There was, eventually, a constitution, and a banking system, and a national currency, with paper notes engraved to look exactly like the real thing. And then came the masterstroke, the single object that turned a clever pose into a machine for taking money. In 1822, MacGregor published a book. It was called Sketch of the Mosquito Shore, including the territory of Poyais, more than 300 pages of it, and it claimed to be the work of a man named Captain Thomas Strangeways, described as a soldier in the service of the Cazique. Captain Strangeways did not exist. The book was almost certainly written by MacGregor and his accomplices, but it was a beautiful piece of work, sober and detailed and convincing, and it described Poyais not as a wilderness, but as a country on the edge of greatness. According to the book, Poyais had a temperate and healthy climate, gentle on European constitutions. Its soil was so rich that crops grew with hardly any effort. Maize 3 times a year, sugar and cotton and tobacco for the taking. Its rivers ran over sand that glittered with gold, free for anyone willing to stoop and gather it. There were forests of fine timber and mahogany, and at the heart of it all stood the capital, a town called St. Joseph, laid out with broad streets and elegant houses, with a domed cathedral, a theater, a bank of Poyais, and a population in the thousands. There were already, the book assured its readers, friendly settlers and a working government, simply waiting for industrious British families to come and complete the picture. All a man needed was a little capital and a little nerve, and a kingdom's worth of opportunity was his. It was a lie, from the first page to the last. But it was a lie that gave people permission to do what they already wanted to do, which is to believe their lives could begin again somewhere clean and golden and far away. That is the engine of almost every great fraud. The con man does not force a fantasy on you. He finds the one you are already carrying and hands it back to you with a price on it. With the book doing its work, MacGregor moved on the money, and he came at it from 2 directions at once. The first was the high road, the bond market. In October of 1822, he arranged, through a respectable London banking house, Sir John Perring, Shaw, Barber and Company, to float a government loan for Poyais, £200,000, an enormous sum secured on the revenues and the land of his imaginary state. The bonds paid 6%, the going rate for a real young republic, and they were listed and traded alongside the bonds of Colombia and Peru, on the same exchange, in the same newspapers. Investors who would never dream of sailing to Central America bought into Poyais from their drawing rooms in London, confident they were lending to a sovereign nation. The bonds were issued at a discount, which suggests a flicker of doubt somewhere in the market, but money was lent all the same, and MacGregor took his cut. The second road was the low road, the one that would do the killing. MacGregor sold the land itself, directly, to ordinary people. He opened a land office and began selling certificates to Poyais acreage, starting at around 2 shillings and 3 pence an acre, then raising the price to 4 shillings as demand grew. A working man could buy a stake in paradise for a few weeks of wages. He sold hundreds of these certificates, and he sold most heavily in Scotland, among his own countrymen, the very people most likely to trust a Highland chief with a famous name and most desperate to escape the poverty and crowding of post-war Britain. Tradesmen, farmers, soldiers, clerks, whole families pooled their savings and signed up to start new lives as the first citizens of Poyais. The cruelty of the detail is hard to overstate. MacGregor did not just take their money for land. He persuaded many of them to convert their savings, their British pounds, into Poyais dollars before they sailed, paper notes printed at his direction, money for a country that did not exist. So a family would arrive at the docks already stripped of real currency, their fortunes turned into pretty engraved promises that the rest of the world would not accept for a loaf of bread. He gave them ranks and offices to match the dream. The cobbler from Edinburgh was to be shoemaker to the princess. A banking clerk was to help run the Bank of Poyais. Each appointment made the country feel more solid and bound its new officer more tightly to the lie. In the autumn of 1822, the first ship sailed. She was the Honduras Packet, and she carried around 70 emigrants out of London on the 10th of September, bound for the Mosquito Coast. These were the pioneers, the people who had believed first and hardest. They sailed with their tools, their best clothes, their commissions in the government of Poyais, and their heads full of St. Joseph and its cathedral. They reached the coast in November, near the mouth of the Black River, and they went ashore looking for their capital city. There was nothing there. No streets, no cathedral, no harbor full of ships, no welcoming officials. There was dense, dripping jungle running down to a swampy shore. The only sign that any European had ever set foot there was the wreckage of a couple of huts where 2 American traders had lived years before, and then abandoned the place. The grand city of St. Joseph existed nowhere but in the pages of Captain Strangeways. The settlers stood on the beach in their wool coats, in the wet heat, and tried to understand what they were looking at. At first, many of them refused to accept the obvious. Surely the city was a little further inland. Surely there had been a mistake, and the right place was just around the next headland. They built rough shelters and waited, certain that officials would arrive, that supplies were coming, that MacGregor or his agents would set everything right. They held on to the dream because the alternative was unthinkable. They had burned every bridge to get here. Then their ship left. The Honduras packet sailed away from that coast, and with her went any easy way home. The settlers were now stranded, a few dozen Europeans with dwindling food and useless paper money, camped on a fever shore thousands of miles from anyone who knew or cared that they were there. In January of 1823, while the first group was already beginning to sicken and starve, the second ship set out, knowing none of this. She was the Kennersley Castle, and she left Leith, the port of Edinburgh, on the 22nd of January, carrying close to 200 more emigrants, most of them Scots. Among them was a sawyer named James Hasty, traveling with his wife and their 3 children, the kind of skilled, sober, hard-working family that any real country would have been glad to have. The Kennersley Castle crossed the Atlantic full of the same hopes, the same commissions, the same Poyais dollars, and arrived at the Black River toward the end of March. What her passengers found waiting for them was not a country. It was the wreckage of the first expedition. The survivors of the Honduras packet, ragged and gaunt and half-mad with the realization of what had been done to them, came out to meet the newcomers. There was no city. There was no government. There was only a larger crowd of people now sharing the same trap on the same beach as the worst possible season arrived. Because the timing could hardly have been crueler. The settlers had landed just as the rainy season came on, and with the rains came the diseases that haunted that coast. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. The Europeans had no resistance to any of it. They had no proper shelter, little clean water, and not nearly enough food, and they had been promised by a guidebook that the climate was mild and the land would feed them. One by one, then in clusters, they began to die. The sick lay in their bamboo huts shaking with fever, while the healthy grew too weak to dig the graves. James Hasty watched 2 of his 3 children sicken and die on that shore. He survived. Many did not. This is where the cobbler from Edinburgh ends his story. He had left his wife and children behind in Scotland, planning to send for them once he was established as shoemaker to the princess, once the workshop and the wages were real. Instead, he lay ill and broken in his hut, and on the 27th of April he understood at last that none of it was ever going to come, that he had thrown his life and his family's future away on a promise made of ink. He loaded his pistol to the muzzle and ended it. The letter to his wife was all he had left to give her. Word of the catastrophe finally reached the only nearby place with European authority, the British settlement at Belize, in what was then British Honduras. The officials there were horrified. They sent boats up the coast to bring the survivors out, and what the rescuers found shocked them: men and women and children dying in the open, clinging to land deeds for a kingdom that had never existed. They evacuated everyone they could and carried them back to Belize, and from there, a few were eventually sent on toward home. By this point, the chief who had signed the original grant, King George Frederick Augustus, had also learned what was being done in his name, and he formally revoked it. He declared that he had never made MacGregor a prince, never authorized him to sell land or raise loans, and that the whole apparatus of Poyais was a fraud. The Cazique, it turned out, was Cazique of nothing. The numbers are grim and, like much in this story, slightly disputed, because record-keeping on a remote jungle coast in 1823 was not exact. Of roughly 250 people who sailed on those 2 ships, at least 180 died, in the camps, in the jungle, or on the wretched journey back. Some accounts put it at 2/3 of all the settlers. Fewer than 50 of them ever made it home to Britain. Whole families had been wiped out. Others, like James Hasty, came back hollowed by grief, having buried their children in soil that belonged to a country on no honest map. There is a detail in the survivors' accounts that is almost harder to bear than the dying. Even after everything, some of them could not quite let go of the dream. A number of the settlers, sick and starving on that beach, refused at first to believe that MacGregor had lied to them on purpose. They decided the Cazique must have been deceived himself by dishonest agents, and that if only word could reach him, he would surely send rescue and put things right. A handful went so far as to draw up a statement defending him. That is how complete the spell was. Men watching their friends die in a swamp that matched nothing they had been promised still found it easier to blame anyone but the smiling prince who had taken their money. It is the same instinct that keeps people loyal to a swindle long after the evidence is in. To admit the con is to admit you were a fool and that the savings and the children and the years are simply gone, with no one coming to give them back. James Hasty did not stay silent. When he finally reached home, the broken sawyer who had lost 2 of his 3 children did something quietly important. He sat down and wrote out what had actually happened, a plain account of the voyage of the Kennersley Castle, the empty beach, the deaths, the misery, and he had it published. It was an ordinary working man's testimony against a prince, and it helped make sure the truth of Poyais could not simply be buried with its dead. The grandest lie of the age was answered, in part, by a grieving carpenter with a pen. You might think that the survivors landing back in Britain in the autumn of 1823 would have been the end of Gregor MacGregor. It was not, because the most astonishing part of this story is what the man did when the truth came home. MacGregor saw it coming. As the bonds slid in value and the awful news began to trickle back across the Atlantic, he did the thing he had always done when the ground gave way beneath him. He ran. Before the first broken survivors reached London in October of 1823, MacGregor and his wife had already slipped out of the country and crossed to France. He left his investors ruined, his settlers dead or destitute, and his name attached to one of the worst disasters of the age. And then, safe in Paris, instead of hiding, instead of repenting, he simply started the entire scheme again. In France, with a fresh audience that had not read the English newspapers, the Cazique of Poyais went back to work. He found new partners, including a company formed to colonize his imaginary land, and he began once more to sell Poyais bonds and Poyais settlement to French families. He aimed for an even larger loan this time. He recruited a new shipload of emigrants, perhaps 30 of them, who obtained passports for a country that the French authorities had never heard of. And that, in the end, is what tripped him. French officials, puzzled that so many people wanted to emigrate to a nation that appeared in none of their records, began to ask questions. The questions led to MacGregor. In September of 1825, several of his associates were arrested, and on the 7th of December, the French police arrested MacGregor himself. He was put on trial in France in 1826 for fraud, and here the story takes its final, maddening turn. Gregor MacGregor talked his way out. He argued, as he always did, that he was a man of honor, a soldier and a prince, the innocent victim of unreliable agents and unforeseen misfortune. Whether the court believed him or simply could not untangle the affair, the result was the same. MacGregor was acquitted. One of his lesser associates took the fall, and the inventor of Poyais walked free. Meanwhile, back in London, the bonds he had sold were doing what fraudulent paper always does in the end. The Poyais loan that had once traded alongside the debt of real republics fell and fell, until by late 1823 it was worth a tiny fraction of its face value, and soon it was worth nothing at all. Anyone holding it was simply out their money. With no country to dun and no government to petition, because the borrower had never existed. And Poyais did not fall alone. It was part of a much larger fever, all through the early 1820s, that rush into shiny foreign opportunities had been building, the loans to young nations, the shares in mining companies that were going to dig silver out of the South American hills, the whole glittering parade of profits just over the horizon. In 1825, that bubble burst in spectacular fashion. A wave of panic swept the London markets. Dozens of banks failed, fortunes vanished, and the country slid into a financial crisis that ranks among the worst of the century. The republics that had borrowed defaulted one after another. Poyais was the most outrageous fraud in the whole affair, but it was not some freak standing apart from the boom. It was the boom taken to its logical end, the moment when the appetite for romantic foreign investment grew so large that it would swallow a country that was never there. He went back to London after that and made at least one more attempt to revive the Poyais bonds, floating yet another scheme later in the decade, though by then the magic was gone and few would touch it. The money dried up. The doors that had once opened for the Cazique began to close. The fashionable rooms, the lords and the bankers, all of it faded. He was an aging man with a famous fraud trailing behind him and not much left to sell. So in 1838, Gregor MacGregor did one last surprising thing. He sailed back to Venezuela, the country whose independence he had genuinely fought for 2 decades earlier, and he asked them to take him in. And remarkably, they did. The young republic chose to remember the brigadier general of the wars of liberation, rather than the swindler of London and Paris. He was granted citizenship and a general's pension. He lived out his final years honored as an old soldier of the revolution. When he died in Caracas on the 4th of December 1845, just shy of 59, he was buried with full military honors in the cathedral, his coffin followed by men who saluted him as a hero of the nation. There is no real justice in that ending, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The man who killed the Edinburgh cobbler and James Hasty's 2 children, who stripped hundreds of poor families of everything they owned, who invented a country and shipped human beings into a deadly swamp to give the invention life, that man died old and decorated, mourned with canon and ceremony. The cobbler lies in an unmarked grave in a jungle that was never anyone's kingdom. The arithmetic of it does not balance, and the centuries since have not made it balance. But the story is not really about whether MacGregor got what he deserved. It is about why so many good and careful people did not see it coming, and about how little has changed. Think about what actually made Poyais work. It was not the flag, or the Constitution, or even the beautiful fake guidebook, though all of those helped. What made it work was that Poyais arrived dressed in the exact costume of legitimacy that everyone around it was already wearing. Its bonds sat on the same page of the same newspaper as the bonds of real new nations, paying the same interest, sold by the same kind of respectable banker. There was a real boom in young countries, so an invented young country did not stand out. The lie did not have to be perfect. It only had to look like everything else that was true. MacGregor did not ask people to believe something impossible. He asked them to believe just one more example of something they were busy believing anyway. That is the trick that never goes out of date. Every generation builds its own boom, its own rush of money toward a thrilling new kind of opportunity that everyone agrees is the future, and every boom grows a few Poyaises inside it, ventures that are pure illusion wearing the borrowed clothes of the real thing. The land of golden rivers becomes the company with no product, the fund with no assets, the nation, the coin, the promise that pays 6% in a world paying 3% and asks only that you not look too closely. The names change, the costume changes, the thing underneath, a confident man handing you back your own hope with a price on it, does not. The next time you are offered something that is safe and exciting at the same time, that everyone respectable seems to be buying, that pays more than it should, and explains away your doubts before you can speak them, Remember the cobbler in the bamboo hut, and the city of St. Joseph that existed only on paper, and ask yourself one quiet question. Have I actually seen this country, or have I only read the guidebook? If you want more forgotten true stories like this one, the kind that still have something to teach us, you know what to do.